And I think we should just go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. All right, just welcome everybody. Asheville's Council on Public Transportation and MTAP, and it's our 2020 virtual winter meeting, so welcome. I'm going to just do a quick housekeeping item, which is please keep yourself muted. Let the panelists get through their presentations, and please use your chat to send us questions and comments. We'd love to hear from you. But again, it's more importantly to keep your mics muted, at least until you want to ask a question that there's discussion time, so we can allow the session to keep going forward. And right now, I'm going to introduce our session moderator, Don Chartok of Washington State. He's the chair of MTAP, and please go ahead, take it away, Don.
Great, welcome everybody. Welcome back to housekeeping as with doing roll call through the chat. And so as you log back in, just share your information in the chat, name, title, and organization. Thank you very much. As I mentioned at the end of the business meeting a half an hour ago, this is something that I'm really looking forward to, a discussion on what's going on across the country as far as budgets and revenue is concerned. I know here in Washington State, we're actually, transit is primarily funded by sales tax. And we've been pleasantly surprised so far that sales tax hasn't dropped. We do, and as a matter of fact, is up. But we're still kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop because unemployment is also going up at a pretty quick rate. And so we can't imagine that people are going to be able to keep spending money at the rate that they're spending it right now. And so I'll be interested to hear what's going on in other states. We have, and Josh has one of the best last names that I've ever heard. So this good hair and good last names will be part of the theme for this presentation. Josh, Kanadarud Hubinger, and hopefully I got that right.
That is actually pretty close. That is not bad.
All right, glad to hear it.
Excellent first effort.
Joining us from Minnesota, and then two old hands, Ron Epstein from New York and Mark Sprick from Texas will be following up with their presentation. So thank you all for joining us. And Josh, why don't you kick us off and start by saying your last name correctly so we can all learn.
Absolutely. Well, good afternoon. Pleasure to be here as a guest, joining from AASHTO Funding and Finance. Susan Howard gets credit for roping me into this. I will be giving a quick update on the picture in Minnesota. I am Josh Kanadarud Hubinger. That is a fun last name, and so there are prizes at the end if you want to try this again. I am the budget director here at the Minnesota DOT. I'll go through a kind of quick overview of transit. I think like many other states, who does what for transit in Minnesota is a little complicated. So I'll quick go through that, take about 10-15 minutes here and just give a quick status update. And I do see Tori Nill is on, so she can chastise me for anything I say incorrectly about Greater Minnesota Transit at least. So next slide, please. All right, so on the screen, this is just an overview of how transit is operated in Minnesota. You can see all the different regions of the state by who provides services. There's 87 counties in Minnesota. These 7-county Twin Cities Metro, Minneapolis and St. Paul being the big cities there. That has about 60% of the total population, and all of that transit is administered by the Metropolitan Council, not MnDOT. It's a separate agency. It's the MPO for the Twin Cities. They operate bus, light rail, and commuter rail in the Twin Cities. As just an order of magnitude in 2019, provided about 92 million rides. The other 80 counties outside of the Twin Cities Metro are managed by MnDOT, by the Office of Transit and Active Transportation that Tori Nill is the office director for. There's a total of 37 public bus systems outstate. We do provide service to some degree in all 80 outstate counties. And again, for order of magnitude, 11.5 million rides in 2019. Next slide, please. So for funding in Minnesota, there's essentially 3 significant pots. So there are federal funds, the kind of standard 5307, 5311, et cetera. But then for unique to Minnesota, there is a chunk that's coming from the state general fund, which is supported by kind of the typical income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes. But out of that, we just get a direct appropriation for both Greater Minnesota and Twin Cities. In the current fiscal year 2021, Greater Minnesota gets about $17 million. That's fairly stable year to year. The Twin Cities Metro got $90 million this year. There's more of a challenge negotiation every year for how much the Twin Cities get as part of that kind of Metro Greater Minnesota challenge we have in our legislature. So as an example, that funding in 22 drops down to under 60 million in the current law. So there's kind of an existing fiscal cliff for Twin Cities regardless of current COVID. And it sounds like we, like Washington, have been somewhat pleasantly surprised in the general fund. So we, the state Minnesota Management and Budget, which is basically our finance agency, just released a new revenue forecast last week. And so for the current fiscal year 2021 biennium, revenues are projected to be down 3.5%, which is far better than the last forecast we had in May when we were first going into COVID. Basically about half as bad as we projected. So the revenue declines back in May were estimated to be more in that 7 to 8% range and have come in far better so far. Again, lots of risk in that forecast for over the winter. Who knows what's going to happen, but to date in COVID era, some pleasant news there. So there's actually right now in fiscal year 2021 a projected surplus at the end of 21. So when the legislature comes back in early January, less risk of significant budget reductions in the current biennium. But in the next upcoming 22-23, we are projected to have a $1.3 billion deficit. And that's far better. In May, that deficit was $4.5 billion. So quite a bit of improvement there, but also, again, quite a bit of risk and uncertainty. And then motor vehicle sales taxes. So in Minnesota, it's a 6.5% tax when you purchase a vehicle, new or used. That entire tax is constitutionally dedicated to transportation, with 40% of that going to transit. And so of that 40%, the Twin Cities Metro gets 90% of that 40%, which is 36% of the total. Greater Minnesota Transit gets the 10% that's left. And you can see in 21, that's about 35 million for Greater Minnesota, 317 million for the Twin Cities Metro. There too, with that revised forecast that just came out last week, things are looking a lot better than they were in our previous forecast. So kind of in line with that state general fund, MVEST, as we call it, MVEST, down about 3% in their current biennium. Back in that COVID forecast we made in May, we were estimating that to be down about 18 or 20%. And so quite a bit of improvement in our most recent forecast. Some good news there. Over the summer, motor vehicle sales tax revenue was actually higher than pre-COVID estimates. And just for kind of comparison's sake, you can see compared to other transportation revenues, motor vehicle sales tax is actually the strongest of our kind of three primary transportation revenues. So our fuel taxes are down about 7% in the current biennium. Registration tax is about 3%. So for transit, some good news. Motor vehicle sales tax revenue has been coming in the strongest of our transportation taxes so far. Next slide, please. Just a quick summary of what we've received in stimulus funds. This is all largely from the CARES Act back in March. So of the $150 billion for that coronavirus relief fund, Minnesota as a state received a little over $2 billion. 300 plus million of that went directly to our two largest metro counties, Hennepin and Ramsey. And the remaining 1.87 billion is managed by the state. State agencies could apply for funds from that and were approved or denied. And so in our case for transportation, the only two pots of money from that large 2 billion or so is one $750,000 pot of money for transporting COVID-19 positive clients in Greater Minnesota Transit, and a similar amount for the Met Council in the Twin Cities. So $1 million out of 2 billion has gone to transit. But separately, FTA got the $25 billion in that same CARES Act. And there, the state of Minnesota made out a lot better for transit. So a little over 300 million in total, about 54 million for Greater Minnesota, which is about 1.5 times what a typical federal year would look like. In 2019, it was about 36 million in kind of typical federal funds. So quite a bit of an infusion for Greater Minnesota Transit. $27 million going directly to some smaller urban area transit systems that went directly to those systems, and then a little over 200 million for the metro area. Next slide, please. This is specific to the Twin Cities Metro. So these charts come courtesy of Metro Transit. And this is just looking at weekday ridership and how that's changed over the course of the pandemic. And you can see quite a decline. No surprise there, down about 60%, 60 to 65% over the course of the pandemic. The mix is a little different depending on the different transit service types. So you can see express bus is down 95%. Rail service is down more in the 80% range, and then local bus has been the strongest performer so far in that 50 to 60% decline. Next slide, please. And this is a similar detail with just a little more breakout of the different types of transit service that are provided in the Twin Cities. So at the bottom, that decline, that's our commuter rail. That's down almost 100%. That's basically down to nothing. You can see North Star in that bottom right corner. The weekday ridership right now is about 100 people. So down to almost nothing. Light rail is down quite a bit. Bus service is only down about half. And then even more strongly performing is our bus rapid transit lines, which are relatively new to the Twin Cities. Next slide, please. And so quick kind of summary of where we're headed from here. So in the Twin Cities Metro, service is running at about 80% of pre-COVID levels. At some points during the summer and spring, it dropped to as low as 60%. Ridership is down 65%. So that obviously translates to some reduced fare box revenue as well. On top of that, there's been additional costs due to COVID. Buses are cleaned and disinfected daily. Modified a variety of the spaces. We're adding more trips in some cases to accommodate social distancing. We're using the longer articulated buses, things like that. But the good news is with that CARES Act funding and the so far relative strength of motor vehicle sales tax, we are anticipating being able to get through calendar year 21 at our current reduced service levels as is. And then long term, I just put question marks. I won't pretend to know what's coming next. Twin Cities especially has some funding challenges that were existing pre-COVID, and those still exist and are going to be exacerbated, but in the short term, we're in a relatively decent spot to get through the current year at least. Next slide, please. And then for Greater Minnesota, ridership down similar levels, about 65%. Here too, that CARES Act funding is really helping as a lifeline. And so the goal is getting through 21, providing kind of the entire operating deficit for local providers through the entire 21 calendar year. And then a secondary goal as available is to address the gaps in the capital programs. And again, here too, the long-term impacts, really don't know what things will look like a year from now. There's going to be a lot of debate in the upcoming legislative session. There's the potential to have a larger transportation funding package that's been floated for about 6 years in a row now with minimal success. So we'll see what happens there. And then obviously the question about, does transit ridership bounce back? Is this the new normal? Is teleworking going to impact that ridership going forward? Lots of questions, not a lot of answers at this point. Next slide, please. Just had some additional resources for the forecast that we just sent out a week ago, more on the transportation revenues. MMB forecast is specific to the State General Fund. There's a really interesting dashboard specific to COVID-19 that our local Minneapolis Fed Reserve keeps updated. And then there's just the links to transit for both Greater Minnesota and the Twin Cities Metro. And that is all I have.
I have one question before we move on to our next panelist, and I guess of other people, I haven't seen any other questions come up in the chat yet. I saw a lot about fare revenue in there. Are some systems making political decisions not to going back to charging fares?
So interesting question, a little out of my wheelhouse. I know in the Twin Cities, it's definitely more forgiving in the current environment. And That's about all I can say, but it's absolutely a different environment now than typically for kind of fare box collection.
And I guess the other thing I saw in the ridership was pretty interesting, that by and large commuter services ridership is down, but I saw that BRT is still relatively high. Is there any analysis of why that is?
I would say part of it is the lines that have opened. They're relatively new and they're the most needed. So they're on very heavy corridors. I think it's not that surprising. There's just a really large need where those corridors exist.
Gotcha. And actually, you just saying that reminds me, when we had our meeting in Minnesota, we got a great demonstration of all the new BRT lines that were going in. And so that was what, 2 years ago now.
Yeah.
Great. Just checking real quick on the chat.
It looked like Tori was going to weigh in maybe on the fare box piece.
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in. So some of the systems are still providing free service to like the healthcare and other essential workers. But yeah, each system, there's 40 systems in Minnesota, and yeah, some are choosing to still not collect, but some are starting to collect. We're doing 100% covering the operating deficit, with the CARES Act and with the awesome, generous state general fund that we get. That was going to end in the end of February, and we just announced extend that through the calendar year. So that might help some of them to, again, not have to charge fare box. So, but yeah, it's system by system, and yeah, some are choosing still not to collect fares.
Yep, that discussion is heating up here. Hey, one last question I saw that came in from my imposter. And so what's the major revenue source for funding transit?
So it's that motor vehicle sales tax for Minnesota. So that was in 2006, there was a constitutional amendment that was passed that dedicated all of that revenue to transportation. It's split 60% goes to roads and bridges and 40% goes to transit. But that's the nice thing there is that's dedicated in the Constitution. So it's been a kind of a lifeline in terms of not so much stability, but at least the guarantee of getting it. That revenue has been very spiky in terms of year to year and what we project versus what we actually collect, but it is constitutionally dedicated.
Hey, Kevin, you want to come on and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Don. Yeah, I was just real quick, Josh. I was wondering that considering the deficit that your state's going to be experiencing here, which transit services were most affected by the reduction in the available state funding that you have, or anticipate? Which areas do you anticipate feeling it the most moving forward?
Yep. So I think there's kind of two pieces. So for the Twin Cities Metro, Met Council, I think strategically reduced bus lines on less traveled routes and emphasized just those heavy corridors. So that was when the reaction to the reduced ridership and fare box revenue, and at that time, the bleak outlook for motor vehicle sales tax revenues. And the risk going forward is now motor vehicle sales tax revenues are looking to be in a better spot, but we still do have this deficit in the state general fund that will be addressed in the upcoming legislative session that starts in a couple weeks here. And so there's obviously that concern of if that translates to actual reductions for Greater Minnesota and the Twin Cities, and that obviously would impact the availability of expansion, which has been the need all along. So there's more BRT lines that are needed. We did get some bonding in a $2 billion bonding bill that passed about a month ago to dedicated to a couple new BRT lines. But the biggest risk I would say is just that general fund appropriation in the upcoming session.
Great, thank
So
you.
I think that's an interesting question for everyone to talk about as they go through their presentations. I've noticed in Washington that it's been a huge refocus on the people who need transit rather than the people who choose to take transit. So all of the white collar workers who can stay home are staying home, and Microsoft and Amazon and those employees. Whereas the people living south of Seattle who are service workers, that ridership didn't drop a single bit. And so there's been a lot of refocusing by our transits on the people who need the service. And so I'd be curious to hear if that's happening also in the other states. let's go. Go ahead.
Don, this is Noel Schickard. I'm also from Minnesota. Just to add to it, I work with the planners for both Met Council DOT, and I'm part of the Office of Transit here in Minnesota. One of the areas that has been increased in terms of the evaluation of potential changes is social equity. So now Met Council uses social equity measures in all of their service evaluation processes. So they've added to that significantly over the recent past or because of recent events. And so that now takes somewhat precedence over productivity and efficiency. So just want to add that component.
That very closely matches what we're going through. Yeah. All right, let's move on to Ron. I think you're up second.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
We sure can.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody, and I hope you're safe. As I mentioned the other day when I gave some remarks, I can't tell you how proud I am of this industry and the sacrifices that this industry has made to ensure basically, that people who have no other alternative, and I just don't mean, low income individuals, I'm talking essential workers, everything, we'll get into this, but how much our contractors, our employees, our service providers have stepped up to ensure that, to the greatest extent practical, people can have some semblance of normalcy. So we should all be proud of that. I feel like there should be some version of virtual Prozac here, because I'm going to give a very different and probably a much bleaker perspective of where we are, not only as an industry, but in general in New York. Let me start out by saying, for those of you who are not familiar with New York, it's more than just the old salsa commercial on TV, right? New York City. We are a very expansive state, very large rural populations here, as well as very densely populated areas. It's about 130 municipal sponsored public transportation systems that support, our residents, more than 8 million trips a day in a non-pandemic era. And it basically accounts for about 1/3 of all the trips taken nationally, again, non-pandemic. I'm not going to go into the slides yet, so I'll just hold at this slide for now. But the thing I want to underscore is we go from the largest system in North America, the MTA, Metropolitan Transportation Authority, to any number of small one-bus rural services that support Lifeline service. The state has a very, expansive and longstanding partnership with these systems. Dates back to the early 1970s. We currently put in about $6.9 billion annually in direct state aid and state authorized support. And to put that into perspective, that's more direct state aid than nearly all the other states combined. While many states see 85% of their workers drive to their jobs, in New York City, 80% of all rush hour commuters to the central business district use transit. So quite a juxtaposition there. Brings us to the pandemic. New York was particularly hit hard, especially in the spring, by the pandemic. On March 1st, we had our first COVID positive. So we went from 1 to yesterday, we had our 740,000 case. We've had 35,000 deaths, and that's included 130 transit workers who basically gave their lives trying to help others get to employment, healthcare, sustenance, whatever it might be. And I'll be discussing ridership shortly, but we're still hovering around 30% of the ridership level compared to pre-pandemic levels. We've had basically a 70% decline. Commuter rail's been closer to 90% declines. And this loss in ridership is compounded by the fact that fares, depending on the area of the state, contribute between 25 and 60% of the operating cost of the system. So it certainly, is an issue. In terms of New York State, the state has experienced a significant decline in revenue, $14.5 billion since last February. We're facing an $8.7 billion deficit for the fiscal year beginning April 1st, 2021. And cumulatively, before things start to recover, at least the projections, we're looking at over $62 billion deficit through 2024. I mean, these numbers, they're just insane. a majority of our state revenues come from the personal income tax, and there has been a lot of talk about, well, we need to have a millionaire's tax, we need to have this. Well, New York is already seeing an exodus of individuals, high income earners, who don't have to live in New York, and they don't have to live in the United States, to be quite honest. About half our personal income tax comes from the top 1-2% of earners in the state. So it's not as simple as saying, hey, let's do a millionaire's tax. The state has reduced spending already this year by $4 billion on a year-to-year basis. We've taken other steps. We've withheld certain aid to locality payments. We've frozen hiring. We've deferred pay. And we continue to advocate for the federal aid that not only do we need, but quite frankly, I would say, I hate to use the word deserve, but that we've demonstrated is directly attributable to the pandemic. So what I would like to do is start going into the slides and talk a little bit about where we are. Next slide, please. So this shows, the blue line is the pre-pandemic ridership being at 100%. And you can see that over the next several quarters, we're going to be lucky if we get back to 50% of the ridership. And even, the out year projections suggest that we get to 75, 80% of the riders at best. Part of this is, next slide, please. Part of this is driven by fear, right? I mean, what is the federal government saying? Don't ride transit. You've got people who are, just afraid of, the COVID is hanging out at bus stops and on buses and trains, more so than anywhere else. I see people who are afraid to ride, public transportation, but you look at their Instagram and you see they're hanging out at all kinds of, what I'll call dangerous places. There's been an increased mode shift. Those that can have shifted their trips to automobiles because they feel safer in their own personal car. The increase in remote work. There's an awful lot of people in New York State who are commuting virtually, including the New York metropolitan area. There's no special events. There's no baseball games, or at least I should say there's no attendance at baseball games, football games, hockey games, concerts. New York is one of those states where we attract some of the premier entertainment in the world, and none of that is happening. We also attract, tourism. I mean, tourism is a $120 billion a year industry for the state of New York. Nobody's flying internationally to New York. It's just not happening. So when you look at this, New York has been hit increasingly hard. That's resulted in reduced employment, not only from core work sectors, what we call the fire industry in New York, financial, insurance, and real estate, but all the service workers dropped. Nobody's staying in hotels. They're not going out to eat in restaurants. It has been a crisis of a proportion that we've never seen before. And as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing an increase in the number of top earners who are just moving. And like I said, they're not necessarily moving to Florida. They're moving, out of the country because they can. And then also there's the employer reductions, where they're just packing up and they're done. Next slide, please. So, I want to talk about this is statewide. I want to talk about the annual transit deficits. The deficits that the transit operations are facing, to put it in no other terms, we're talking the budgets of third world countries here. You're looking at huge deficits going through the out years, and that's assuming we have a recovery, by the way, in terms of vaccine and some sort of immunity. If this is a very prolonged event, multi-year, I mean, these numbers are going to go through the roof. But next year we're looking at over a $6 billion transit operating deficit, and that's after CARES that has been fully expended and everything else. So very difficult time here in New York for our public transportation systems. And I'll get to the impact of that in a little bit. Next slide, please. Just a quick slide here that shows that, this is not a New York problem. This is a national problem. And I don't know how else to say it, but, in the spring, New York got the crap kicked out of us. Now the rest of the country is finally starting to get the crap kicked out of us. And we wish no ill on anybody, but I think you're starting to experience the employment impacts, the economic growth impacts or lack thereof. It's really become one of those issues where employment rates are falling, through the floor, and we've never seen this kind of decline in our gross domestic product and or our employment rates. Next slide. So, we talk about revenue impacts, and I would say that these numbers are still fluid. I mean, it's still New York is as much as we've done to combat this common enemy we call the coronavirus. We have seen significant declines in revenue. We locked down early on, which is why you're seeing some of these numbers. But as much as we've done, we're starting to see an uptick again post-holiday season, and we're coming into another holiday season where it may drive the numbers higher. So these are probably on the low end, but sales tax provides a fair amount of revenue towards certain systems. I mean, they're down 22% statewide. New York City is down over 40%. Think about it. Like I mentioned earlier, there's no tourism. There's nobody coming over from wherever to go see a play. I mean, there is no play. There is no sporting events. There is no social activity. You see other states, and you see everything going on, whatever it might be. There's nothing happening here in New York because we have such dense population centers. We cannot afford the risk. Motor fuel taxes down 13%. Auto rental taxes, again, no travel, no rental. I would say probably the only reason it's not down further is because we're renting vehicles to help with our coronavirus relief. Highway use tax, it's a tax on trucks, not down as much as others, but down. Petroleum business tax, one of our larger taxes, down 15%. Real estate, we're waiting for that to come back lower again, but down 16%. So there's no other way to say it. We're getting our butts kicked. Revenue is falling, beyond anything we could have ever imagined. And it doesn't matter what the feds do, and I'll get to that in a second. These are revenue losses that are directly attributable to Corona. They have nothing to do with New York's policies or whatever other people want to say in Congress. It's not about pensions and legacy costs. This is related to the virus. Next slide, please. So what's going on here basically is that, it's one thing to say that, oh, that's a New York problem or that's a California problem. It's a blue state problem. No, it's all of our problems. I would say that as I go through these numbers, while it might have a few extra zeros associated with it, you're all starting to see these impacts. I mean, we are facing from the MTA on down reductions in service and frequency of up to 50%, if not more. We're looking at over 10,000 job cuts if we don't get any additional federal aid and wage freezes. And I'm just talking about the public transportation sector now. Deferred maintenance and state of good repair. Well, there's no money to do anything. I mean, it's not a choice. It's a reality. We've canceled projects unless they've already started, and this is on the transit side, unless they've already started or there's a federal share, a significant federal share, they're not moving forward. We're seeing an increase, believe it or not, we're seeing an increase in congestion. While transit is still hovering around 30% of where we were pre-pandemic levels, the traffic is back up to 90%. And I can tell you in New York, 90% is congestion. So, we're seeing increased traffic and congestion. One of the things that we always love to talk about public transportation in New York, largely because of the MTA, but we are a huge reason why we don't emit more carbon in this country. Right now, New York State, and it has been for decades because of public transportation support, New York uses the least energy per capita for transportation purposes of any state in the nation. Well, that's going to change. If you don't have these services, we're going to emit more carbon. They're going to have to look in fare and toll increases, and already there's been discussion about fare increases. And we're going to, again, we're going to have to rely on increased short-term borrowing and additional borrowing costs. And right now, borrowing is as much as 25% of, some of the system's budgets. It gets to a point where you're paying debt service over providing services, basic services to the public. Next slide. So when I say that, New York needs money, I mean, we all need money. Listen, I'm not saying here New York should get something that the other systems should not get. We all should get money. We need money. It's not because we did something wrong. It's not because of policy we set. This is a direct reaction to the coronavirus, the losses that we are experiencing. But putting all that aside, prior to this, when you look at how federal funding is distributed, and I just happen to take out the largest urbanized areas in the nation, we, because of the tremendous amounts of trips, we really get a fraction of the funds. So one of the things that I'm going to say here is that as we look at emergency relief, and I'm using air quotes now in terms of emergency relief, we need to look at where the need is. We can't just use the same historical aid formulas to distribute transit relief. Otherwise, we're going to do what we didn't care for the most part. A lot of systems are struggling with how am I going to spend this money and where am I going to spend this money, because they weren't where New York was back in March, April, and May. But, we need, something that will recognize and address the impacts that we have experienced, but will also preserve enough revenue that will address your need when it's your state's, impact that has to be addressed. Next slide. When you look at the vendors, basically, we could talk about public transportation and whether, there is support for transit or not support for transit. I think everybody in Congress agrees on the fact that there's a need to support businesses. Public transportation is one of the larger industries that benefit other sectors in our economy. There are lots of companies who do public transportation support, and they may do other things like the Army or whatever it might be. I'm thinking of like a BAE Systems or one of those companies. But one of the things we're seeing, and I stole this data from APTA, so I want to give credit where credit is due. 86% of businesses that support the transit industry, they're actually seeing a reduction in contracts and work coming in. That's resulted in them having to furlough employees. 1/3 of the employees that work for these businesses have already been furloughed, and it's only going to get worse if there's no relief. Again, we're seeing, if Congress doesn't provide emergency funding, we're looking at widespread layoffs in the manufacturing sector, whether it be buses, whether it be steel, whether it be concrete, because systems are not going forward with major capital investments, and they're not going to be providing the same level of service if there is no emergency relief. And I think the thing that should be most alarming to us is about 1/3 of the companies have expressed concern that they may not survive the pandemic. So even if the relief does come, it still might not be enough to save them. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to use this slide to say that, there's always this conversation, which I'd rather not have, about like who uses transit. But I think nothing, to me stands out more than essential workers in today's environment. And I stole this chart as well. I think this was produced by Transit Center. Of the workers, this is not trips, but of the workers that have been identified as essential, 38% of the people who are essential workers are using public transportation on a daily basis in New York. Nationwide, it's over 2.8 million people who are defined as essential workers, who rely on our support and our service to get to hospitals, to get to nursing homes, to get to distribution and testing centers. This is not, a luxury. This is a necessity. And it not only is essential for our economic health, it's responsible for our recovery. Next slide. I do want to talk about, the challenges that we have ahead of us, because we do, and Rich, please give me the hook whenever you're ready. I'll be quick here, but Highway Trust Fund, Congress hasn't gotten their act together since 2008 in terms of how to address the core program. We need strong, reliable funding. They can't rely on annual transfers. Next slide. This just illustrates that over the 10-year period, largely would be the obligations that are needed for the 5-year period of the next program. We need about $190 billion in new revenue just to maintain the same inadequate levels of federal aid that we have today. Next slide. And we need them to act quickly, because one of the things that's very apparent to me is that, basically since, ICE-T, there's been an enormous inability, and largely driven by revenue. They don't know where to get the revenue from, inability to come to agreement on a long-term bill. The worst thing that we can have in this fiscal uncertainty is a series of extensions. And yes, we do have a 1-year extension. And yes, we thank Congress for doing that. That helps a lot. We need an appropriations bill. We need to get that done. But we certainly can't wait an average of 3 years to get another longer term authorization bill done. Next slide, please. The challenge that we all face here, and whether this is, pandemic relief, whether this is the core program, whether this is stimulus, it has to do with the national debt. And this is from the CBO. The biggest problem that we have is the national debt. We've basically reached the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling has been suspended for the last couple of years. By the end of the year, Congress is going to have to come to some sort of agreement on the debt ceiling and how to address it, if to address it, whether to suspend it again. But investments in infrastructure, as I mentioned, they are necessary for our economic health and recovery. But as long as this trajectory continues to go upwards, it's going to be very difficult on Congress. They're going to have to identify new techniques for which to address the scoring problems that they have. Next slide. So I'll end with this. there have been a number of congressional actions that have been sitting in waiting for, somebody to be a champion. You've got the Invest Act, you've got the Heroes 2 Act, you've got, separate proposals that would address state and local stabilization. You've got the incoming administration talking about, literally a stimulus bill with the foundation being infrastructure. I don't know that states care what it is, but we care that it comes soon and that it have large amounts and that it needs to address, our public transportation systems, our public health systems, our public highway systems. We need some sort of agreement that up until now has been very elusive. And the longer it continues, the bigger the problem is going to continue to be. And we will certainly not be able to recover if this goes on any longer. So I do apologize that I don't have as cheery a message as maybe others have experienced. But I'm telling you, we are hurting. We are hurting bad. These are not sustainable numbers that we've talked about. And even if we get the act that's before Congress now, it is but a down payment on a much larger problem that has to be addressed. This can't be the end all be all if they agree to a $908 or $1 billion emergency relief bill. We need a lot more as a country. This is not the Northeast. This is not the West Coast. This is everybody. So with that, I'll open it up to any sarcastic comments you may have.
Wow, I should have had some sarcastic comments ready. Hey, so I'm curious about, so you went through your different, and by the way, I'll start and anybody else who has questions, put them in the chat or they can just chime in. But I'm curious first of all, what's the primary revenue source that goes to transit in New York State?
So we have a very diverse portfolio of revenues. And again, if I had to look at probably the most significant, I'm going to say the petroleum business tax. But we also have payroll taxes, and we've got a huge number of corporate taxes that we tax profits to help sustain the systems that bring employees to their front door. So, I wouldn't say there's one predominant, but petroleum business tax, which is ironic because here we're relying on a tax for a decaying industry and one that was also impacted during the pandemic, meaning fossil fuels.
The other thing that really piqued my curiosity in your presentation is early on in your projections for reduced ridership going into the future. I know when talking with our planners and transits here, everyone's kind of shrugging their shoulders about what ridership's going to be like after the pandemic is over. So I'm curious about what were the assumptions that went into the decreased ridership?
Well, I think the primary assumption is there's going to be a certain number of employers who have realized that I don't have to pay rent, that I can have teleworkers, and a certain amount that just won't survive.
Mm-hmm. So is this information that, for example, I don't necessarily want to get into the fine details, but that's captured somewhere about how those assumptions and for those projections were done?
Yeah, keep me honest. And we have data on how we came up with the ridership projections, as well as very lengthy projections on finance.
I may try to grab them for you to hand off to our planners and folks to see.
Yeah, and again, everybody is different. So I mean, I can tell you that we can give you assumptions. New York really got hit hard. I mean, before, and so your experience, and you have some companies out there that are doing extraordinarily well, largely because they are a virtual company, and they can sustain impacts that we can't.
I get it. I'm just curious, just from a transit geek perspective in terms of what are the different ways you do that math. Okay, just gonna take a quick look at the chats. Okay, anybody else have any questions they want to chime in with? All right.
Now's the time, folks. I saw Chris Seilinger have he had a comment that I assume it had a little bit of sarcasm in it. There's got to be a modicum of truth to it.
Well, apparently I've offended somebody by using Wile E. Coyote. Chris, I hope you're doing well.
I think it's awesome to see Wile E. Coyote come up in a transit presentation, Ron, and I really think your comments were spot on.
Thank you.
All right. And I guess we can always circle back after we're done. Why don't we move on to Mark? Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.
Hey, Don, this is Josh. I just wanted to quick piggyback off of that though. So just to clarify for Minnesota, we are holding serve the way we have. That does not mean there's not a huge unmet need that we are going to be advocating for in terms of more funding. So I just wanted to make that clear that we're kind of holding our shoestrings together well in the short term, but there is a huge gap between what we need for transit and what we currently have. Just wanted to, if I didn't
Great.
hammer
Yeah.
that home before, just wanted to make that clear.
Hey,
Right, we have
Ron,
jobs to do, right?
hey,
Okay,
Ron, this is Dave Harris. One of the things that's come to light over this time is, and I talked to friends of mine who work at New Jersey Transit, and it seems like, New Jersey Transit isn't in as dire straits as MTA in New York. And I guess it all comes down to you guys having, better fare box recovery and higher revenues than them. Even though you're all part of the same region, that their revenue or their funding outlook isn't as bleak as MTA, just due to you guys having just higher revenues and, better fare box recovery than New Jersey Transit overall. And it seems to be, the case throughout the country that the guys, the big boys who have the higher fare box recoveries are in the most dire need at this time.
Well, I think, Dave, I would say a couple of things about that. And again, my friends at New Jersey Transit, by the way, I hope you're doing well. My friends at New Jersey Transit, I know they're very worried, but keep in mind, so New York has it is the largest system in North America, the MTA. And so there's a fair amount of fixed costs that go along with the size. So yes, it's true that the subway system has like a 60-something% fare box recovery rate. Losing that fare box hurts, but you still have this enormous system, whether you're running passengers or not, you have to maintain. And that's the issue that we're dealing with. We did actually, for the first time in its history, close down the subway every night for a few hours a night to decontaminate trains. I think the New York City subway system is probably the cleanest it's ever been since the day it opened, if not cleaner. I would say, well, I know it is. It's much cleaner than my vehicle. But at the end of the day, it's a combination of lost fare revenue and the extent of the system and the fixed costs that go along with that. It's salaries, it's energy, it's maintenance, it's enormous. I mean, when you look at the MTA, it's 70,000 people who keep that system going. I mean, it is literally a country unto of itself. And so New Jersey, my point is, they don't have as large an infrastructure.
Right. Yeah, no, you probably just, if you pick one borough, if you counted the number of stairway banisters in one station, you might have more stairway banisters in, I don't know, maybe like a 1 mile radius of a few stations than a lot of commuter rail systems have stations themselves. So
Right.
there's there's a lot to maintain. I get
so
it.
If it snows, even if it snows, which I know it doesn't do in New Mexico most of the time, but if it snows,
Except for right at the moment.
Yeah, you still have to shovel the stairs, right? Whether or not
Yeah.
there's one person going through or 100,000 people going through.
Well, we feel for you. And,
Thank you, I appreciate it.
We do.
And again,
I thought we were only doing sarcastic comments, but okay.
Yeah, it's okay. No, and again, I can't tell you, the workers in New York and around the country, I just cannot tell you how much they have done for our country. And the one thing I truly hope that people will realize, but they don't, is that transit workers are heroes. I've said that before. You heard me say it the other day, but it is the truth.
Yeah, it came up in some earlier discussions today about making sure that they're in line to get vaccines in the appropriate order. So, hey, let's go ahead and transition. And Mark, take it away.
All right, thank you, Don. I think Texas experience is not as bleak as what Ron is experiencing, at least not across the whole state, and certainly the rural and small urban portions of the state that TxDOT assists the most. So, hopefully we'll end here on a little cheerier note. but I would say that the number one thing we've kind of learned from all this is we're trying to do better at dealing with uncertainty, because frankly, week to week, month to month, the picture seems to keep changing. I heard a little bit of that in Josh's presentation. I would say that, you know, we at the other end of I-35 from Minnesota are experiencing very similar kinds of things. So with that, next slide. A little bit about us here in Texas, and I'm going to focus just on the pieces of transit in Texas that TxDOT works directly with. So I won't be talking much about Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, or El Paso. But for those customers we have out there at TxDOT, we're serving a little less than half the state's population. We serve a large part of the land area, though, and with the exception of 6 counties that are metropolitan only, we only have one of the 254 counties of the state that don't have a rural system in it. And as you can see here, 29 million trips, more or less, each year. We've got 36 rural transit districts that are all that gray area on the map. 30 urban transit districts, about 40 5310 subrecipients. And not on this list are our 25 regional planning agencies that get our planning funds, and a fleet of about 1,700. So that gives you a sense of some of the scale of the program. Next slide, please. And within TxDOT's 12,000 employees, we got about 50 in our division, public transportation division. 51, I guess, up to now. 3 of those are our bike pedestrian program, which is FHWA funded. 48 of us on the transit staff. Of that, about half here in the Austin headquarters, mostly program managers and the support staff that I have, planning, communications, finance, SSO. And then about half of our staff actually reside in our 25 district offices across the state. Those are the folks dealing most directly with grant agreements with our subrecipients out there. Right now, we're, with CARES Act included, we're managing about $733 million in grants, and I think we're up to about 400 and some grant agreements that is included. So pretty good size operation. Next slide, please. So, you know, CARES Act came along, and I'll talk about economic impacts to Texas in a moment, but just impact to our division. We normally get about 100 million plus a year, about a third of that from the state funds, and the rest federal. And then CARES Act comes along, and suddenly we are presented with about close to 150% more funding on top of what we already were allocated, like you all, for fiscal year 20. We decided early on, we got with our subrecipients and asked them, of this 143 million, once you take down intercity bus and all the rest, we're going to have a lot of money. How much of it do we think we really need between February and the end of our fiscal year, at the end of August? And then how much will that leave us for next year? And as you can see on the slide here, it split it not quite in half, about 74 million for this year or this past fiscal year, and 68 million for the current fiscal year we're in. It was interesting when we surveyed our agencies, and I guess that was in late March and early April. It appeared to us that at first we thought we would need all of the $443 million right away, but because of service reductions and other things, we got back information from most of our agencies saying they weren't anticipating as high of expenses, at least right away. Even though there were, as Ron mentioned, a lot of fixed costs with certain systems. And And as it's turned out, I don't think we're even spending that much as of today. I think for fiscal year 20, we spent about 48 million of that 74 million. Next slide, please. So like the rest of the country, we took an economic hit with the pandemic. I will tell you that we were starting to feel a little bit of a reduction in state general revenues even before the pandemic due to the oil and natural gas prices going down. And a lot of state revenues derive out of the energy sector here because of the drop in the price of an oil barrel. We were already seeing some reduction. But of course, the pandemic came along and made it even worse. And the last estimate we saw was that general revenues are going to be down about 10% from last fiscal year. And that's bad enough. The interesting thing, or maybe a different thing about Texas, we don't get much of our state highway and transportation funds from general revenue. We get them from dedicated sources. Fuel tax, motor vehicle registration tax, some bonds. What we don't yet know is what is the impact of all this going to have to those dedicated sources. We've seen some numbers similar to what Josh showed for Minnesota, where it doesn't look like on the fuel tax or the vehicle registration or vehicle sales taxes that we're taking quite as bad a hit on the transportation funds as we originally thought we would. Certainly nothing close to 9.5% like the general revenue loss. But we really don't know yet. We're hoping to find out soon. But just anecdotally, at this point in the year, it feels traffic-wise and economic activity-wise that a lot of Texas, except for El Paso, has bounced back pretty well. Traffic here in Austin is back up to about 90% of what it was prior to the pandemic. Economic activity seems strong. And so I think this 9.5% drop when it gets readjusted in January may not be as bad as we originally thought. Next slide. So because of the feedback we got from everyone that they didn't think they were going to need all that CARES Act money right away, we kind of adopted an approach to deal with this uncertainty that we called our 3 priorities, more or less time phased with some overlap. Priority 1 is obviously the immediate need that everyone had. Of course, huge drops in fare box revenues at the beginning of this pandemic. You know, ridership dropped well below half of what it had been same time in fiscal year 19. It's still down, I don't think quite as much right now, but obviously the immediate need was, you know, how do we help these systems out and pay drivers and keep buses going and everything. A fair number of our systems rely on local sources of revenue besides fare box, and those were taking a hit as well. So we were anticipating need to provide this CARES Act money along with the state funds we have to keep them going. But the big question was, well, what happens next? Given all the uncertainty with state revenues, we could be facing a situation here where next fiscal year, we don't have the normal $21 million of state funds to give out to our 36 rural transit districts. Could we use in priority 2, we're calling economic recovery, could we use some of that CARES Act money to make up for that loss of state revenue and keep everyone whole? It's looking like that we're going to go ahead and award most of that on that basis coming up at the beginning of the year. I will tell you that even right now, we're not 100% sure if that's going to be appropriate for everyone. I think, Ron, you mentioned something about, you know, the normal needs-based way of figuring out who needs funding just doesn't work. And we're finding that to be the case even here. our regular formulas and other performance and need-based calculations to distribute funding has just been thrown out of whack because of this pandemic. And then we had a third priority we called resilience, was going to be if we had anything left over, how could we use it for equipment, technology, anything else that might help us deal with future issues like this. Bottom line is we just don't know. And so, and I don't know if I mentioned, but in our state, a lot of our funding is formula driven for transparency purposes. You know, with a large state with a very diverse set of transit providers, we feel like we almost have to go with a very transparent process to get the money out. The pandemic has made our normal processes not quite irrelevant, but certainly thrown a dent in how we do business. Next slide. So for this fiscal year past, we figured out we had enough money, and now we're going into fiscal year 21. We're not sure yet. Our legislature meets in January. We have a part-time legislature, and it meets from January to May every other year. And our state comptroller should be giving us our state funding estimates for fiscal year 22 coming up, and impacts to 21 here in January. So we'll know more hopefully towards the end of next month. But we're ready with this CARES Act funding that we have left over to help cover the state losses. The balance of that we will be using for discretionary awards based on other needs that we're not sure how we're going to figure that out yet. We're of course still analyzing our fiscal year 20 data. We know for sure that it's going to be a skewed year. Beyond that, we're not sure how much. Again, probably in another month or so, we'll have more information. But we feel like we've got a program set up that as flexible as we can be. We're ready, and we feel like we've got enough funding. The real issue is then what happens next. Next slide, please. So in 2022 and beyond is the real wild card. And I think Ron and Josh touched on this too very well. What are going to be the long-term systemic hits and changes, frankly, in transit ridership to all of our states based on this? Just as one example, Austin has a fair number of high-tech employees, and most of them used to go downtown to buildings that now are empty. And we're hearing from many of those large agency or large companies that they're going to be teleworking on a permanent basis, and they have no intentions on returning to large office buildings downtown. What does that mean as far as transit needs from rural areas into the urban areas? We're not seeing quite that kind of effect on our smaller rural areas, but this could be a real shift in travel markets and travel patterns. We're not yet sure how that's going to translate into what that means for the funding between our metro, urban, and rural areas. I have also detected from Federal Transit Administration that they're kind of wanting us to spend this CARES Act money as quickly as we can. Our plan, as you can see here, kind of drags the money out a little bit. We're going to see how that goes with Region 6. So we're kind of dragging our heels a little bit. I'm thinking that we'll get it at least obligated in trams in the next 6 months, but as far as spending it, because of this uncertainty, we're not sure how quickly that's going to go down. So we'll see. Lot of uncertainty, a lot of open questions. I think my feeling is that even the Federal Transit Administration is not quite sure what to do with some of this. I haven't talked with anyone lately, but I'm getting the sense that most states are spending their CARES Act funds pretty quickly, but not as quickly as someone in Washington, D.C. may want. So hopefully someone from FTA will chime in on that. We'll find out. Next slide. I think just in wrap up, we're set. We're about as ready as we can be. I feel like we're in a pretty good position, and we will see if this phased approach works. We haven't gotten any pushback from anyone in our state agencies anyways, or agencies around the state. It feels pretty comfortable. And so we feel like it's working out as intended. It's working out well, and we're probably in a little better position than most states. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Hey, Mark. I have
Jennifer?
I've got a question. We got the pressure to accelerate the commitment of our CARES funds. We had originally had a plan that was very similar to yours, and got the push from FTA. So we've gone ahead and applied for and have committed all of our CARES Act funding. But in doing that, we now have a pretty significant balance of regular Section 5311 funding that we have not done anything with, because we've used CARES to basically carry everything through fiscal 21, everything.
Right.
Have you guys had any, have you had any kind of conversation with FTA about your regular 5311 funding with all the emphasis on CARES? Because I think we're asking for a little bit of relief and some more time.
Yes, we had applied, we had obligated our fiscal year 20 5311 funds right about the time the CARES Act came in. And it's just sitting there. And to my knowledge, Region 6 anyways, really hasn't hit us up about it very much. Their emphasis has been getting POPs for the CARES Act in. And right now we've only got about half of it in there. So the next half will be going in, like I said, probably January. We were intending to wait till April, but we decided we'll go ahead and do it coming up. But no, they haven't really pushed us on the regular funding. And it's $35 million just sitting there. Yeah, we do have it, we got it approved grant.
Yeah, I think that's what we have.
Yeah, the MPRs and FFRs aren't going to show very much.
So I can tell you, if anybody's having a problem with spending their money, feel free to send it to New York, 50 Wolf Road, Albany, New York. Anyway, seriously, no, you raise a very critical point here that I don't want to lose.
How many stamps will it take, Ron, to go?
I'll send you the postage. The biggest concern that I have is that, and I love our friends at FTA. I mean, I do, and they're doing great work to help us through this crisis. But the perception in Congress is money that doesn't spend is money that's not needed. And, there really needs to be some very, open and honest conversations about how people are trying to do the right thing. I mean, this is the problem with performance metrics. If the performance metric is just spend them, and we have spent our CARES money, I mean, in multiple areas, we're over 100%. But the bottom line is that the metric could be the wrong metric. You would spend it on the wrong things as opposed to having a reasonable plan. So I do think we need to have some conversations as an association with the federal government about why the money isn't moving, how we plan on using the CARES, and why we've chosen this approach. Because there needs to be that ability to communicate, because if expenditures, disbursements are the only measure, then my fear is, just like ERA, there were some instances where people said, well, why did we do that? And I'd rather have good public use of the dollars for sustaining services than basically rushing to the exit door just to meet an arbitrary goal.
I know one of the things that we've run into is, so first of all, we allowed people to apply for lost revenue, which was allowable by FTA, and that's helped spending down of the revenue. I see Faraz came on. He's our budget manager. Faraz, you want to chime in on anything?
Yeah, I was going to raise my hand, and Mark and Jennifer, you actually bring a really important point. We are in the same place. We're trying to spend CARES funds first, and we have a balance of 5311 sitting there right now. We have a state management review scheduled for this month, and one of the questions we received is you obligated the funds, yet you're not spending them. And we're planning actually to tell them exactly that. I don't know how we're going to word it. Basically, we are trying to spend CARES funds first, and we are in pandemic time, and we'll see how that goes. And I can share with you after we go through the SMR how it went on our end. The other thing is, something was on my mind is, if you don't spend on a grant for, I believe, a year, it goes inactive. I think that's the rule, and I'm worried about that too. So we need to think about how to address that part. And I'm hoping this question will get addressed by FDA, and something like going inactive, for example, will be put on hold, or we'll get an extension for 2 years or something. So we don't have to deal with that part either.
Now, I guess the other thing, though, I mean, I'm pretty sure that other states are the same. We have a long list of replacement needs, vehicle replacement needs, where we may normally put 5311 into operating, which we mainly do here in Washington State. I have a long list of vehicles that are well beyond their useful life benchmark that we could replace as well. Now, of course, a lot of that depends on, can the industry deliver too on those vehicles in a timely manner.
Yeah, I agree with that, Don. I think that's where we're going to go if we feel like we're getting pushed to start spending that formula funding. The tricky part is, based on how some of these agencies are affected, they're not even needing as much capital as they did before, or they need different kinds, and I think they're trying to figure out what that is. But yeah, we've detected no real. Now we've got a state management review ourselves coming up later this year. It's been postponed twice, and I think this is going to be a topic on the table. What do we do with that regular fiscal year 5311 money, and what does FTA think we should do with it? And we'll see.
This is Dave. So they basically gave us almost 3 years worth of money, right? And if you spend every single dollar on admin and operating at 100% for all your rurals, supposedly that 3 years that they've given you, or 2.8 years of funding, should take about 2 years to spend if you work out the math. So the fact that, I think to an extent talking about clawbacks is a bit unreasonable. The call that, Jen described where she's asking to be spent it faster is, I don't know, I think that's unreasonable, because if they want to balance the money where they're spending, their 5311 on capital and maybe some other things, their 5311 and 5339 on capital, and maybe they're spending it on some other operating issues. But the fact that that's even an issue yet, because the way I look at it is we're 9 months into from when we got the CARES money. So if you divide 9 months over 24 months, 2 years, that's 37.5%. And if you're somewhere around, you spent 37.5%, 30 to 40% of that money so far, you should be okay, be viewed as okay. It's a reasonable place to be as far as spending, those CARES dollars at this point, from my perspective. In New Mexico, and I only have this because my staff put this together the other day, we received 36.4 million or 36.5, and we've expended almost 11 million of that so far.
Dave, is
So
that both 5311 and small urban 5307?
no, that's just CARES 5311.
Okay.
So that's 30%. And I'm spending it all. Like we, it's all admin and operating. We don't spend it on capital, but it's all admin and operating. So through 9 months, we've spent 30%, which, it seems to be a fair, and I don't even know if this includes, a lot of the November expenses yet. But that's where we are. I think it's reasonable. Yeah, I think there's a concern about not spending the other money. The money that, from your, in some cases, some of us have 18 money, a little bit of 18 money, a little bit more of 19 money. And in a state like mine, we're a year behind. So we spend the 18 money in 19. So we spent our 18 money in 19. So we probably have a little bit of 17 left. We probably have a little bit of 18 left. We probably have all of our 19 and all of our 20. And we'll have all of our 21. So I'm looking at ways to start spending some of that 5311 on just capital. Like if you had a facility that we were reluctant to participate in before, just because we want to make sure we have enough admin and operating. I mean, it's almost the flip side of, Ron's dire circumstances. This CARES money has really made it possible for, and this is just us. This is me administering money. It's not my personal budget situation, but, we've made it possible for the localities that if they need to use that money somewhere else, and we're also a state where we don't provide any recurring state funding, to help match these federal funds. So even with that, in a small state like New Mexico, where we have an okay situation, where things aren't dire, no one's scrambling. If whatever you want to try, we're willing to help you try. But I think when you break it down and you look at like what's reasonable, that may not be reasonable obviously it's not reasonable for a large urban, but in a place where like ours, these funds have really helped shore up some differences, made people feel more comfortable, made them feel that, they didn't have to furlough or lay off anyone during this whole time, being able to provide essential services, and take the time that they needed to do it in a safe manner. But when you just look at it, yeah, it's only been 9 months, really, if you started from March.
I know. And I think one of the other things is that for us is state money goes away and federal money doesn't go away. And so a lot of our transits have been rushing to spend their state money first, so that they can get that done. And, we're all used to saying, oh, well, if it goes over our fiscal biennium, it doesn't really matter, for that federal money. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as well. Listen, we're going to spend our money. And that, while we're all game planning and learning from each other about the best way to do it, it's not as though that's not going to happen. Also, the other thing I'll say is when you average in both the small urban and the large urban, we are majority spent. So both Metro in King County and stuff like that, they've already spent their entire CARES Act amount. So our urban areas are really way ahead at drawing down that funding. So,
Hey, Don, I see Ian Ritz has a question in the chat. Ian, since this is a discussion, why don't you open your mic and go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, hi. I'll make a comment before I get to the question. New Mexico kind of alluded to it. Before COVID, Wisconsin, we were kind of same year programming what we were apportioned at the federal level. So, if it was federal fiscal 20, we would be spending in calendar year 20. So we always had a bit of a struggle getting budget sorted, applications sorted, a grant submitted to FTA, reviewed, approved, et cetera, we'd end up being pretty late in actually being able to reimburse expenses for our subrecipients. And that was an ongoing frustration. It's kind of structural for us. So with the CARES Act money, it allowed us to kind of, accumulate these formula funds and get a year behind. Well, we'll be kind of closer to 2 years behind now with the formula. And so that's a benefit for us, kind of an external benefit. So that should theoretically help us more efficiently and effectively make grants with FTA and then get the money out the door to local communities. And then, I was curious, the question I have in the chat was more along the lines of, is anybody, as you're looking at these balances of 5311 and maybe the needs are covered better on the rural side, is there any consideration around, flexing it into the 5307, a small urban program? And I'm just curious if what other states may have.
Yeah, here to. Well, what about you, Ian? What are you doing that?
We no decisions have been made. I think something like that may be on the table. There's always a little bit of tension about, making sure the rurals are served appropriately. Wisconsin, we're pretty diverse state in terms of, one very large urban area, some other, relatively large urban areas. And we have a lot of small urbans, and then we have a lot of rural too. So we've got kind of this good blend. And it's, sometimes the optics of giving money from the rurals to urbans doesn't look great. But
I'll die on that hill. I won't go for it. I think the problem that we're suffering right now is a short-term problem. Our rurals will continue to need our help going on much more than our urban systems will going into the future. And so I think our battle will be to just take the time, and I can't remember who said it, spend it right on the right things. And if we want to argue about rescission and clawing money back, we can do that. But I think that's not something I'd ever entertain. What do other people think?
Just to go back to what Ian said, if this just builds you up that year of slack, it's really nice to not be waiting for that appropriation to come. And I think, typically it comes in December, but it's come as late as March, and maybe a full year has come even later than March. But so it's nice to have that year of slack. I mean, we had it here just because people weren't spending it before. But if that creates that year of slack, and you're basically moving into another year of slack of appropriation, the thing I think, that Ron doesn't necessarily need to be, jealous of, because we're in a good position, is, historically, I mean, transit, they haven't given us enough money to help the rural transit agencies, not only on the vehicles. I mean, the 5339 money has helped recently, but they haven't given us money to help, those small rurals with their facilities for the most part, especially in a state like mine where we don't have state funding for transit. So I'm going to be looking, to spend money spend that FTA money on facilities, help them upgrade their facilities, help them upgrade technology, get them with the times, upgrade technology on buses, upgrade technology in their facilities. So I look at it as an opportunity, and, COVID was the cause for the money, but I think there was there was decades of neglect that we could potentially use this to our advantage to help us upgrade.
I'm gonna go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Ron.
Go ahead, Ron.
I just want to take a counter position to that. I mean, I really understand and respect what you're saying, and I am jealous, right? I mean, I wish we were in that situation, but what I can tell you is that what we're seeing 5310 and 5311 sponsors tell us that they can no longer afford to provide services. and they can't come up with match or this or that. And while it hasn't impacted maybe New Mexico or Washington State or some other area as hard, for the most part, your areas of the country are just really experiencing the full impact. And really, I'm not sure we know how long this will be with us. I mean, we could talk about vaccines and everything, but it's going to take a long time. What is there, 300 whatever million people in the country? So I don't know if this is going away anytime short. And the greater impact there is on local resources, I think you're going to start to see that some of your local municipalities are going to say, you know what, we're done with this. We have to make choices, and this is not a service that we can support any longer. So, while on the initial side, when you're looking at the grant money that maybe is unobligated at this point or obligated, but has room for projects, what I would say is that that might be a very short-term, short-lived experience. I think we're going to be feeling the repercussions of this pandemic for, like I said, years, if not decades to come. When you compare this to the Great Depression, this is on steroids. And like I said, many states are just now experiencing what some of the other states experienced early on in the spring. So just look at what's going on and think about, like, what do you do when your munis are just like throwing up their hands?
And this is, and Ron, I think that's a great point. And this is a snapshot. And 2 months from now, I might have a different take. And then 6 months from now, another different take. And a year from now, I might just be like, oh my God, I'm jealous of New York and their troubles they were having a year ago because I've just lost half my transit agencies. That's what it could be. And I guess in my, naive viewpoint of hopefully this potentially ending by the summer, and us, retreating back to some sort of normalcy. I guess that's my naive viewpoint at this point, but we don't know. And there are loads of question marks from Josh's presentation earlier. There's loads of question marks. And, and I don't want to be in that situation where I've spent, a whole year on facilities. And then I'm like, oh my God, we needed that money, right? But, we'll also need the flexibility from FTA to spend some of that older money into the future. But, I guess we'll just have to put it in a grant to be safe and sort of earmark it, obligate it in a grant in whatever safe line item that we think we should. So I think those are great points, Ron. And we're going to play it safe, but these are just things I'm looking at this snapshot in time. And it could be totally different by March or May. If the vaccine doesn't work, we'll be sitting here for a while.
Well, and vaccine is one of the issues, but Congress is the other issue. I mean, again, I'm telling you, this issue of like unobligated balances and potential rescissions, and this is real. They may just, say, you know what, sorry, we're going to put it into this new act, and you live and die by whatever rules there might be there. This country, its national debt is probably going to be the single largest obstacle facing the new incoming administration and their ability to respond and enhance funding for everything. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, it's Amtrak, it's roads and bridges, it's private bus companies, it's healthcare, it's hospitals, everything. The whole country is suffering, and so I don't know what the appetite is to, we become such a McDonald's generation to, drive through and get it within 30 seconds, that I don't know what the appetite of Congress is to hold on to any money.
We are coming up against it. Let's, and what people have any other thoughts that they wanted to share about this issue? All right. Hey, this has been fascinating. I really enjoyed hearing from everybody. So thank you to our panelists. And even thank you to Ron for, now we understand why he lost all his hair, because he had to go through all of this. And so thank you for all of this information to everybody. And I look forward to picking up with next week's sessions. Richard, when do we all meet again?
Well, let's first start with thanking ASHTO's premier and capital sponsors who so generously donated to the organization to help us keep us going, as well as let's also thank our meeting sponsors, both Route Match by Uber and Panther International. They're fantastic and they continue to sponsor the winter meeting, and we enjoy having them around. And in terms of it's a wrap, guys. Please join us next for session 6, grant sub-recipient management tools and practices. Have a great day, everybody, and see you next week. Take care. Thanks, everybody. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm pretty sure we all got the point, even if you were going in and out, Richard. All right.
Unstable
Thanks, Don and
internet.
Richard. See you guys later.
Bye, y'all.
See y'all next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.